Hi. I've done a million of these, but they've all been in front of computers, so I appreciate you guys coming out for this. It means a lot. Thank you to Magers Quinn. This place is awesome. Easily, I would say, the best bookstore in Minneapolis. Thanks to friends, family, and people I haven't met yet for coming out for this. And John, I would highly recommend A Clean Heart. I read it last fall, I believe. When was it that came out? Shortly after it came out. Just a very inspiring, beautiful book. Thoroughly enjoyed it. But I'm going to talk to you about my book. This is my first book. It's called Love, Zach. This is the paperback. The hardcover came out last fall. It's always great to come out with a book about concussions and CTE and football and suicide in the middle of a global pandemic. But I do think that this story is incredibly important. And I think it's varied. Look, you think CTE, suicide, football, concussions. You think I'm a football fan. I don't want to read that book. But I think this book, if there's anything that it does well, it's that it talks about both the risks and the rewards of football. Why we love it and why we, as parents, as Americans, should be cautious about it. But the first, I want to tell you about Zach. Zach's full name is Zach Easter. And the first time I ever heard the name Zach Easter was in his obituary. It was a couple days before Christmas 2015. We had just moved up to Minneapolis from Iowa, where we lived for a decade. We were back visiting my family for Christmas, and a friend passed on an obituary in the Des Moines Register, which is a newspaper that I used to work for, that Chase right here used to work for, that my lovely wife back there used to work for. And my friend said, you should check this obituary out. Look, it was an obituary for a 24-year-old guy, an incredibly good-looking 24-year-old guy, and it seemed like the world was this kid's oyster. He had everything in front of him. He had just graduated from college. He was on the honors roll, on the honor roll. He had a wonderful, smart, vivacious girlfriend. He was a huge Green Bay Packers fan, worshipped the Green Bay Packers, loved hunting. It seemed like he had everything in front of him. But with Zach, he couldn't see any of that. All he could see was this future that was just absolutely destroyed by this brain disease that was creeping into his head. This brain disease that he had believed that he had gotten from 9 years of playing football from third grade through his senior year of high school. And it was the final paragraph of this obituary that really not just spoke to me, but said, Reid, you need to find more about this young man and his family. And I'm going to read this to you. Zach was a selfless person. His last wish was to make sure that no one else has to struggle from head trauma like he did. It is important to Zach to tell his story about CTE, a disease he attempted to manage for years. He suffered from, and remember, this is a 24-year-old man. He suffered from severe migraines, brain tremors, slurred speech, blurred vision, and dementia, among other physical ailments. He unselfishly is donating his brain, along with a detailed diary that documented his life, so that no one suffers the way that he did. He bravely fought this silent disease for years until he was no longer able. His spirit will always be with us. Zach asked that memorials be donated to the Concussion Legacy Foundation so that further research can be done on this disease. His final request is that people talk about CTE, support more research, and to value knowledge. And that's how I found myself in Zach Easter's family's living room 2 weeks after he died by suicide. It was the first Sunday of January 2016. And I remember the 10-point buck that Zach had nabbed his senior year of high school was right on the wall beside me. Hunting was just as important to this family as football was. These are their two ways to make a man, to turn an American boy into the American man. And also behind us, as we're talking about everything about Zach. We're talking about all this great potential, and we're talking about this never-ending spiral that he went into. And as we're talking this bright afternoon, behind us is the last game of the regular season between the Minnesota Vikings and the Green Bay Packers. Vikings were Zach's father's
favorite team, and Packers were Zach's favorite team. And I just remember being struck, like, is there a more poignant metaphor for how America feels about football than that? Even when you lose your son, even when this is so fresh, you still have the game on. You're still checking your phone to look at fantasy football scores for the football team that you, Zach's father, just took over for his son after his death. That's how ingrained this sport is in us. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I happen to love football, even if I am very cautious about it and very worried about it. I have two sons who are thankfully very plugged into the iPad right now back there. And I worry, if they play football, what could happen to them? I spent a lot of my career examining human suffering. In maybe a morbid way, I'm a little bit drawn to it. And I think there can be great meaning when people are able to get to the other side of suffering. And from that very first afternoon with Zach Easter's family, I knew there was something special and there was really something vital about his story. And to me, his story and all the reams of journals that he left behind and that his family graciously and courageously gave to me, you could see this guy who wants his story to live on. And ultimately, I hope that's what this book does. And I appreciate you guys coming out to listen to me talk and hopefully to continue to spread Zach's story. There haven't been many stories that I've come across in this business, in this industry, in this world that I am as almost feeling called to continue telling it. And Zach's is at the top of that list. I'm going to read you guys the prologue to this book. It's a short prologue. It is, I guess I would offer somewhat of a trigger warning. This is about Zach's first suicide attempt. Ultimately, he did not die in this attempt. Spoiler alert. But as you can probably tell from this book, I'm not spoiling the end of the book by telling you Zach does die. That's why we have this book about him. So I'm just going to read this short prologue, and then John and I will talk. Zach Easter stood on the long wooden dock leading out on the Lake Aquabi, gripping the .40 caliber pistol he'd given his dad for Father's Day, not even 5 months before. The sun had dipped over the horizon on the other side of the Y-shaped lake. Leaves lay in heaps on the fringe of the woods. The gusty November winds died down as the sun sank in the horizon, but there was still a chill in the air. Winter was coming. Zach took out his phone and snapped a picture. He posted it to Snapchat, ignoring the frantic phone calls that were pouring into his phone. God bless America, he captioned the photo. Where is Zach? All around Zach's hometown, friends and family were terrified. They'd seen his Facebook post a few minutes before. If you're reading this, then God bless the times we've had together. Please forgive me. I'm taking the selfish road out. Only God understands what I've been through. I will always watch over you. They needed to stop him, but how? They didn't even know where he was. From the house where Zach grew up, a few miles away and amidst fields of corn, his parents called. Zach did not pick up. From the small town just down the street, where Zach had played high school football, and from Des Moines, the big capital city not quite 20 miles to the north, his friends called. Zach did not pick up. At 5:36 p.m., a college roommate texted him, "Hey, what are you up to, bud?" No reply. From the law school at Case Western Reserve University, almost 700 miles away in Cleveland, Ohio, Allie Epperson, Zach's girlfriend and the only person to whom he had fully confided his struggles with his rapidly deteriorating brain, called. Zach did not pick up. She called again. He did not pick up. She called again. Finally, Zach picked up. There was terror in his voice. "I can't do this," he told her. "It's never going to get better." Allie, a vivacious law student who in many ways was Zach's opposite, a bleeding heart liberal who balanced out Zach's dyed-in-the-wool conservatism, was freaking out. How many hours had she spent on the phone with him, talking about the disease that seemed to be eating his brain from the inside? How many times had the two talked about the sport he loved, the sport that had consumed much of his childhood but now seemed to be consuming the rest of his life as well? How many times had she told him that a real man was not stoic and unfeeling, that a real man must face his demons instead of suffering silently in deference to some antiquated ideal of masculinity. How many times had she told him not to apologize to her, that she loved him despite the crazy stuff that was going on, and that they would work through it all together? Earlier on this day, Friday the 13th of all days in November 2015, he had apologized again. "I'm sorry you fell in love with a guy with a ducked-up brain," Zach had texted her, his phone's autocorrect softening the swear word. He'd awoken early, started drinking, and called Allie in a panic late in the morning, shit-faced and swerving his car around the suburbs. She'd coaxed him to drive into a gas station, then into a Jimmy John's to grab a sandwich and sober up. She'd calmed him like she always did. He'd apologized like he always did. She'd texted him back. "You can't choose who you fall in love with. You just fall in love." Then he'd texted an ominous reply. "If anything happens to me, just by a chance of luck, tell my family everything." Now things were happening. A friend noticed the setting of Zach's Snapchat photo, the beach on Lake Aquabi, where Zach and Allie had escaped to in the summer to get away from high school friends and stare at the clouds. The lake was just down the road from his family's house. The lake's name is derived from an ancient Algonquian language. It means resting place. Allie kept Zach on the phone. "Listen to the sound of my voice," she soothed him. "Listen to the sound of my voice." "I'm losing my mind," he cried. "This is it for me." One Warren County Sheriff's Office cruiser came speeding down the winding hill toward the lake, followed by another. "Allie, did you send these cops here?" The cops got closer to him. He started apologizing to Allie, and he told her he wanted his brain donated for research. Then Zach's phone cut out. Out on the dock, Zach pointed the pistol at the darkened sky and fired a warning shot. That is when a pickup truck sped down the hill and slammed to a stop next to the lake. Zach's father, a burly former high school football coach named Miles Easter, jumped out. The parking lot quickly filled with squad cars. One deputy, a former all-conference linebacker who played for Miles on the same high school team Zach had played for, trained his assault rifle on Zach. Lasers from other police rifles danced on Zach's body. The evening was dark and it was getting cold. Miles saw the cherry red 2008 Mazda 3 that Zach called Old Red. He peered into the window of his son's car. He saw an empty six-pack of Coors Light, an empty bottle of Captain Morgan rum, and a pill bottle. Floodlights illuminated Zach. A black curtain fell on the water behind him. Zach stood up from a picnic table and walked down the pier toward a wooden fishing hut at water's edge. A few more steps and he'd be inside, alone on the water, out of sight. "Put your gun down," the deputy shouted. "Nope," Zach yelled with an anguished laugh. "Not gonna do that." In a flash, Zach's father realized what was happening to him. Zach wants police to shoot him. "Fuck it," Miles said to himself. "I can't let this happen." Zach's father sprinted past the sheriff's deputies and onto the pier. "Zach," he shouted. "If he shoots me, he shoots me," the father thought. "Dad, stop." As Miles Easter ran toward his son, Zach's face came into focus. His blue eyes looked foggy and confused. The expression on his still boyish face matched the tenor of his voice. Sad, sick, exhausted, scared, worn down by life, beaten once and for all. "Zach, I'm coming," Miles said. "Put your gun down." "Dad," Zach shouted. "Dad, stop." Then, gripping his father's pistol, Zach disappeared into the fishing hut. The door slammed shut behind him, and Zach Easter was alone. A little heavy. Yeah. Try comedy with my next book. It's heavy stuff. I don't have to tell you guys that, but I do think like Zach and his father. There's a reason I started the book with that because it's an absolutely tortured relationship. It's one of the most important relationships in Zach's life, and I think it says a lot about America and football and how much we as American men, we as American fathers, think of that sport as a way to create the traditional American man, for better and for worse. So, John Rosengren.
Take this out. Can you hear me without a microphone, Reid?
I can.
Okay.
Annie, is
I
that okay?
imagine you can out there too.
Did I just say Annie? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Is that okay, Annie?
Yes.
Um,
Sure.
So that's such a powerful section, Reid, that you, the opening, and I remember just reading that and crying and being gripped by it. And, you know, as you said, it introduces these issues of a story of fathers and sons, a story of the making of an American boy into the American man, the tortured relationship with football. And so, yeah, I mean, it's an excellent beginning and just so powerful. I want to hear some more of your thoughts on that. I also want to ask you about the building of this book. And you mentioned the genesis, the idea of the obituary that we sent. Can you tell us a bit more about then how you went about discovering the story? And I'm sure you reached out to family, met with the family, and then...
Yeah, so I used to live in Iowa. We had just moved up to Minnesota 6 months before. But I knew a lot of people in Iowa. I knew Indianola, Iowa. I'd been there a dozen times, 24 times. They're known for motorcycle nights on the Old Town Square and a balloon festival, like a hot air balloon festival they have every September. We've been out to it. We brought our kid out to it when he was a baby. I knew this town. I had a couple friends who lived there, and I reached out to some friends. It must have been Christmas Eve, day before Christmas, a couple days before Christmas, and tried to get in touch with his mom, Brenda. She's the president of their Chamber of Commerce in this small town. I didn't know her before this, but I reached out, probably to half dozen people. I ended up getting an email back from Brenda saying, and this was, she emailed me, and we talked briefly, and it must have been 2 days after he was buried. This was so fresh. And in this business, I work in newspaper journalism now. I've done magazine stuff. We do a lot of talking with people who've been through tragedies. You've done that too. It's not that often, especially with suicide, that you talk with someone when it is so fresh. Yeah. And for her to say, come on down, I was kind of like, wow. At the time, I was writing for Fox Sports and doing TV for Fox Sports 1. And I went and met with this family. And it was I was covering college basketball at the time. I was going down to a Kansas Jayhawks game and stopped at the family's house on the way down. I went down a day early. And I remember I spent 4 hours sitting on their living room floor. Both the parents, the older of his two brothers, his girlfriend, the trainer for his high school football team, who had so much on her heart about this, and a couple family friends. And when I'm there talking with them, again, for 4 hours with an NFL game on in the background, talking about these journals he left behind, talking about his life, talking about what he was like as a baby and as a kid and as a teenager, and then talking about this descent because of all the issues that he had relating to concussions and the aftermath of concussions. This whole time I'm talking with him, Zach's aunt is in the kitchen. I can see her like through the doorway. She's writing thank you letters for people who came to the funeral. That's how fresh this was. And if it weren't for, this is a tragedy. This is the darkest of clouds. But I think if there's one silver lining to this, it's that Zach left behind all these writings. He left behind a bunch of journals. He left behind this 39-page autobiography. These are like primary source materials for the book. If he hadn't left these behind, both with an explanation of, hey, here's what I was going through, and then also sort of challenging his parents and his family and his girlfriend to spread his story, I can't imagine the family would have been so motivated to share this story in its, and not just glossing over it. And I explained this to him pretty early on this was an article in GQ first and then became a book. But pretty early on, I explained to him, like, this story, the power is in its pain and, like, the embarrassing things and the painful things. And the fact that he is the boy next door. We're not talking about Junior Seau. We're not talking about Derek Bugard. We're not talking about some multi-millionaire athlete. We're talking about a kid that you guys know. Even if you don't know Zach Easter, you know that slightly wild child who loves sports, who's a little bit unhinged, who's super smart, doesn't care about school, but who everyone loves. Like, you know Zach Easter. And honestly, from that moment on, I half-heartedly pitched it as a story I could write for Fox Sports, and that maybe we could do a TV documentary on it for 10 minutes to run on our news show. Thankfully, the news show said no, which cleared me to go write it for someone else. But honestly, I can remember getting in my car to drive back to Lawrence, Kansas for a basketball game the next night. If there are any college basketball fans here, it was the game when Buddy Hield scored 46 points in double overtime. Anybody remember that? These things are like burned into my memory, right? But I remember going back into my car and I called my wife and I was like, what did I just go through? Like, this is one of the most significant stories I've ever come across. You spend your whole career looking for, at least I do, like those heartbreaking stories that have a news hook, that are important to what's going on in the world today. And an old friend just emails you an obituary and just falls in your lap. But honestly, it was like from that moment on, I didn't know it would become a book. And neither did my agent after my proposal got rejected for 6 months before a publisher very smartly grabbed it. But I didn't know it was going to be a book, but I knew that this was an important story that I felt called to tell and to continue to tell.
Well, I'm so glad that they did finally.
Me too.
Pick it up, and because it is an important story, and maybe we can just jump to that about the issues that it brings up. And I want to go straight to CT and the danger of football and the concussions and the subconcussive hits, which are really at the heart of CTE. Yeah. And I mean, nobody can watch 5 minutes of football without realizing this is a dangerous game. This is bad for the brain, right? And yet we're drawn to it, and I know you're a big fan, and like Miles, football coach, right?
Yeah.
Who, you know, I would think, or I mean, doesn't condemn the game, and yet recognizes its role in his son's death. And how then? I'm interested in your perspective as a fan and as a parent about football and its place in our society, and maybe one day your family's life.
I often feel like a hypocrite, to be completely honest. Yesterday, I was at a third grader's birthday party at a bowling alley with both my kids, and birthday party's up. It was outdoor. They had a wiffle ball stadium at a bowling alley. It was awesome. But I'm like, kids, we got to go watch overtime for the Vikings game. Come inside the bar with me. I have my older son doesn't really like football. My younger son is like, Daddy, can I record the Vikings game? So I do feel like a hypocrite because this sport is like I grew up playing baseball very poorly, but I grew up loving and playing baseball. And baseball's the American pastime, right? It's football is so you can't call football pastime. You don't pass the time with football. It's an obsession. It's like our sporting religion. My favorite part of researching this book was going into the history of football and how it starts as an American, like it kind of morphs out of like soccer and rugby, but the first football games right after the Civil War, and how there's all these like crises in masculinity over the next 150 years. You have JFK writing in Sports Illustrated about the crisis of American masculinity, the softening of the American man. Football is always seen as sort of an antidote to that. Is it toxic masculinity? Is that how we look at it these days? Certainly some of it is. Is it also traditional masculinity, kind of what we want from the American man, strength and being able to fight through, I mean, everything, the cliches that the football coaches say. Yeah, I think there's some power in that. So I see this book first and foremost as a cautionary tale. But I don't think that caution is don't play football, period. That would just be preaching to the choir, right? If someone hates football, they're going to say it anyway. My mom being one of those people. I see this book as take this seriously. If your kid's playing football, and if my kids play football, it won't be until later, by the way. Like age 14 would be the earliest. I think like tackle football at age 8 is insane when you're playing the pass. It's crazy. And I think the world is moving away from that. But if they do play football, we will be watching that with an eagle eye, because there's not a X-ray to say, hey man, you got a broken bone, you can't go back out there. You're just it's a bunch of guesswork right now. Maybe that changes in the coming decades with concussions. But last thing on this topic, you bring up the subconcussive hits. That's such an important topic, and I think football will survive as a sport, as the America's favorite sport. And I put a little asterisk next to it, but for subconcussive hits. What subconcussive hits are, when you think of a concussion, it's like the massive hit to the head that knocks someone out and they're dizzy and they're falling over. Those aren't subconcussive hits. These are like the smaller hits that, if you're a lineman and it'll happen 50, 60 times a game, you never get knocked out by it. But it just builds up over time. There was a doctor that said it really well in a podcast I was listening to a few weeks ago. If a concussion is $1, then subconcussive hits can be 10 dimes. It still adds up. You can, for the most part, legislate concussions out of the game. There will always be the freak hits, but as far as like taking the head out of the game, I think like football as an institution has done a pretty good job over the past decade. It's always going to be a contact sport. People are always going to get hurt. But the 15-yard penalties, we kick you out of the game at a moment's notice, it's gotten way better than just a decade ago. You can't legislate subconcussive hits out of the game. And if we find out that is ultimately what's behind CTE, the bigger risk factor, then I think that's where parents go from being like, I'm a little uncertain about this sport, to nope, not going to do it. And then if that does happen, which honestly I hope it doesn't, for the safety of American kids, but also because I think there's a lot of good to be gained from that sport. If it does happen, I think that football will go away because the pipeline dries up.
Yeah. I do think subconcussive hits are the root of it, from what I've learned in my research. And
yeah, it's both, right? But yeah,
So let me just play devil's advocate for a moment. Mick Tingelhoff's obituary is in the paper today. He was a longtime center for the Minnesota Vikings. During the sweet spot of my sports love affair with football when I was a kid, I loved those teams in the 70s, the Vikings. And I remember seeing it. We were in security at the airport one time. He's a Hall of Famer too, but I remember being in security at the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport 5-6 years ago. And Tingelhoff was in line. He happened to reach out to my son and say hello. And my son was kind of freaked out by him. He was a middle schooler, and he's like, "Who's that guy?" And because he was off. I mean, Tingelhoff had CT, suffered from some dementia, and was friendly, but you could tell his brain wasn't working properly. And it was just so sad to see, that up close and in person. And in a non-professional setting for me, where I've not interviewed someone, but I've just seen them in personal and seen the reaction like kid. And so, and you've heard all the stories of all the guys of that generation that have CT and suffered from it. And how then do you justify turning on the TV other than being a hypocrite? That's easy.
I mean, part of it's a hypocrite, right?
But I mean, how can we justify that we still allow this to go on?
I think we look at, hey, it's getting safer. I think you can look at Roger Goodell and rip on him, and he's an easy punching bag, right? But if you look at NFL, just the past decade, there have been like 4 dozen rule changes. Are you going to change it are you going to end concussion epidemic through rule changes? No. There have also been safer helmets, much safer helmets. Are you going to end it through helmets? No. There's also been a boatload of scientific research going on. That, I think, will get you a lot further than helmets or rule changes. But to me, ultimately, it's a question of football culture and sort of that tough it out culture that needs to change. And frankly, I think to some extent has changed. These decisions are now. Let's look at the NFL, right? The spectacle, the biggest spectacle of football is the NFL. The decisions are taken out of the coach's hands. They're taken out of the player's hands. They have an independent neurological consultant on the sideline. I remember last January, divisional playoff weekend, and I read about this in an essay at the end of the paperback. It was a Saturday game and a Sunday game, playoff games. You lose and you're done. The Ravens lost, and Lamar Jackson, their quarterback, 2018 MVP, hit his head, knocked out of the game with a concussion. And I remember at at that moment, people were like, he's not coming back in the game. You knew he wasn't coming back in from the moment he hit his head and came up wobbly. Next day, Kansas City Chiefs playing, Patrick Mahomes hits his head, stands up, sort of is wobbly, and they're like, he's out of the game. There's this assumption now that if you have a concussion, you are not coming back in this game. I think you can look at football and say football's never going to be safe, right? But you can say it has absolutely gotten safer. And I think there is some element of risk that we take when we play any sport. I think in football that is absolutely heightened. That's also why we love this sport. We love it not in spite of the danger, but frankly, like because of it. There is that sort of medievalness to it, this gladiatorness to it. Maybe it is hypocrisy, but maybe I think there is something powerful in facing your greatest physical fear and being like, I'm gonna go up against it. I'm gonna face this fear, and that makes all those athletic achievements that happen in the face of that fear, I think, that much greater. So there's hypocrisy, there's cognitive dissonance, there's all these things that are like that we as a culture and me as an individual are just embedded in. But I think it's because there are always going to be risks. I think there are rewards to it too, not just like, hey, we're going to drink some beers and watch a game, and there's a bunch of millions of dollars of advertising and all these businesses behind it. I think there's something about football that's different than any other sport. The camaraderie, the true teamwork that comes in football. I think the closest that we get in any other sport is in soccer, which also has issues with concussions, with headers, trying to take headers out of the game. There's U.S. soccer, I think, is now it's no heading before age 14, I believe. But yeah, we love it not in spite of the danger, but because of it. And I think that is why we are willing to tolerate some level of our athletes, our kids will get hurt and some damage really, really seriously because of it. It's crazy to say when I say it out loud. It sounds crazy.
But I admire how you grapple with those questions in this book, and in your response now. And I think important. You raise important points to discuss, and through a very powerful personal story of this young man. I'd wanted to ask you too. Sometimes what will happen to me is after I write something, people will reach out to me. I'll learn more about the subject. And I'm like, damn, I wish they'd gotten me before. Did that happen to you? And did you find some stuff that is included in the paperback version that isn't in the hardcover? Or?
Just the essay at the end that I referenced. As far as what I've learned after it, the family took the publishing of this book really hard, which I guess one would assume that they would. This is like taking the worst thing that could ever happen in any parent's life, and really airing the dirty laundry doesn't even begin to describe what's happening here.
Right.
They appreciated it, but I remember in the couple weeks before the hardcover was released, talking to Brenda Easter. She had already read the book. She didn't love it, but she, I think, understood why it had to be so painful and understood the meaning behind it. But the family, they took it really hard because, and I think when I look at Brenda Easter, Zach's mom, and Miles Easter, Zach's dad, they've taken two very different routes after his death and after the publication of this book. Zach's dad, he's like Midwestern masculinity. He's the hunter and the football player, played Division I football, high school football coach. He reacted in the absolute cliche way that you'd think. His therapy was to go in the backyard with a six-pack, and his two dogs, and a shotgun, and see if he can catch some possums. He had this kill list on his refrigerator. This is the small town rural family that they are. He had a kill list, and every year he'd have a new kill list, and it'd be like possum, 8 possums this year, and 2 deer, and a muskrat. That was his therapy. He just buried it as deep as he could. Zach's father, he feels torn about football, but not in the way you'd expect. I asked him if he still watches football, if he still likes it, just after this book came out. I asked him again after the book came out, and he's like, I just can't watch the NFL anymore. Oh, really? Why? He's like, man, they've just sissified it too much. It's just like a track meet out there. And he feels so much guilt for his son's death and his role in it. But he also looks back to what football meant to him, his definition of how he became a man and how he raised his 3 boys to become a man, and it was central to it. Zach's mother has gone a very different way, very much into activism, working with the governor of Iowa on concussion task forces. They founded a nonprofit. Zach's mom and his girlfriend are 2 of the absolute leaders of this, called CTE Hope. They do a bunch of they try to fund scientific ways to tackle, that's a metaphor, to try to combat CTE and concussions. What they're hoping for is this saliva test that could happen on the sideline after you get a big hit. Spit in a cup, test the enzymes. Hey, young man, you have a concussion. You are not playing. Takes the guesswork out of it. She looks at football before the book came out and after. She hates it. She absolutely hates it. She's told her other 2 sons, her grandkids will never play this sport. She can't watch it. She can't stomach it. She recognizes that her husband and her 2 sons still watch it, still love it. Even if they think it's too much of a track meet, husband will still tune in to watch the Vikings choke again, as they did yesterday. He's still a huge Vikings fan. And I think even if you look at Zach's writings, especially if you look at Zach's writings, you see this tortured relationship with football. He blames it for, he's saying, I'm going to die, and it's because of football. And yet he's so proud of how he played football and how he was the toughest guy out there. It's complicated, right? And I think that's like the world I hope this book lives in, is that complicated world where I don't know how we should feel about football. I really don't. I want all our kids to live and be safe, live till 85, maybe 90. But I love football, and I think there's something to it that we just take on some sort of risk because we recognize there's something special about it.
Well, that complicated nature does come through, and the complexity of it. But I think we should open it up to other people to ask questions.
Yeah,
and hear
perfect.
What is it you'd like to know and hear from Reid about his book or what we've been talking about?
What's the sports establishment, if you will, or what's the response been from?
So I
your
think
world?
The big picture response to all this. A decade ago, it was denialism. There was a guy who did, their doctor, they had 2 head of their concussion committee, and they weren't at all qualified. And one of them was known as Dr. No. He was on an HBO documentary. They kept asking him, are football and concussions related? No. He answered 7 times and said no. That was symbolic of where the NFL was. Because they're like, we put our fingers in our ears. We just don't want to hear it. We don't want there to be a book or a movie or anyone to even talk about football, concussion, CTE, suicide. No. I think the NFL is flipped. They realize, not just the NFL, NFL on down to Pop Warner. Everyone realizes this is not just an important safety question, an obviously important safety question, but an existential question for the sport, right? If they stick with that denialism, football will eventually go away. If you look at the numbers of participation in football at high school level, there can be some you're like, oh my gosh, our news articles where it's down 3% this year. It's gone down pretty steadily over the past decade. It's not dropped off a cliff. I think it's gone down 10% in the past decade. There's still more high school boys who play football than any other sport by a factor of 2. And I do think there's a bit of a red state, blue state divide where it's gone down steeper in blue states than it has in red states, who I think put more of a value on football. But I think the response after, frankly, a couple decades of denialism, when Paul Tagliabue, the old commissioner of the NFL, was very first time he was asked about this, it was, I think, it's in the book, it's like 1990 or so, before this was ever really an issue. And he said, I think this is a pack journalism issue, frankly. Those are his exact words. Is there anything that gets you more pissed off as a journalist than a man in power saying that? I don't know what does. The NFL realizes, they still don't love to talk about it, but they realize how important it is, and foundational to the future of the sport.
Has there, I know there was a pandemic going on, but has there been reaction to your book?
Yeah, it's more like not from the NFL, not from the powers that be. They can ignore a book like this in a way that they couldn't ignore the movie Concussion, a big Hollywood movie starring Will Smith. I think the concussion, the reaction among the community that are activists, concussion activists, a lot of families that have dealt with this, has been really positive. It's been heartbreaking, but I think they believe, as I do, how much power there is in the story of the boy next door. Like, to me, the tipping point with the concussion epidemic, where we went from denialism to holy shitism, was Junior Seau, and he died by suicide in 2012, April or May 2012. But you can write that off. Zach's dad wrote those suicides off for years. The Andre Waters, the Dave Dewars, and the Junior Seaus, all these sort of prominent NFL names. Zach's dad says, I think it's fake. I think these guys don't know what to do with themselves now that they don't make millions anymore, and they don't have all that fame and adulation. They're out of the league, and they're 45 and 50, and they've lost their meaning. That's what Zach's dad did. But you can't do that when it's Zach Easter. And I think those are important stories to put in people's faces, and stories that really make people, especially football fans, really uncomfortable.
Can you talk more about, just after you wrote the article in GQ, just your process of really deciding this was a book, and just your process of writing it, especially because you've been doing a lot of articles and hadn't done a book before?
I asked my GQ editor, when this came out, I've never had a story that's gotten a response like this before. It came out during the NFL playoffs in January of 2000. I don't even remember what year it was. Was I ice fishing? Was ice fishing? I was ice fishing. It came out like a year after Zach's death, so in January 2017. It was my first time ice fishing. But I remember being out on the lake and being like looking through my Twitter mentions and just like, oh my gosh, this is taking off. And I remember talking to my editor after that at GQ, and he's like, I don't think there's a book in here, but I think there's a great. He told me why there should be like a TV series about this. He's like, you got to get the right young actor who wants an Oscar type role. And he had this whole theory about why it wasn't a book, that it was a TV series. I was like, how do I make it a TV series? I don't know. So I was like, oh, I guess it's not a book. But then, yeah, right, exactly. Just option it, so it can never get made. But some agents reached out to me, some book agents who thought it could be a book, and I talked with a few of them, and one of them was just awesome. And like, I knew that I didn't want the story to end with just a magazine story. I knew that I wanted to do more. I didn't know what that would be. I've always wanted to write a book. I've never had any idea how to go about writing a book. And I had this awesome agent who's like, here's how you write a book proposal, and talked me through it and edited it, and didn't sell it for 6 months, and I kind of had given up on it. I was like, all right, well, give that a try. It was an interesting experience, and got a phone call from my agent just completely randomly in February, and he'd been shopping it for 6 months, and he had told me, he's like, yeah, it almost sold to HarperCollins, but it got to the last person, they're like, they got through all these levels, and they're like, concussion books don't sell. Which, hey, he was right. Yeah, he just told me, he's like, hey, your book just sold. I was like, what? I literally not forgotten, but I was like, all right, I gave up on this. And it was part of yeah, I think it was just, I just wanted it to keep going somehow. I just didn't know how.
One more? Anyone?
Hey, Reid.
What's up, man?
On time.
Yeah.
What sport do you think will overtake, if there is going to be anyone to overtake football in this hyper management replacement?
Yeah, it's a great question. So
Let's
let's say football in the next 30 years, the next generation or two, sort of becomes like boxing, right? Either like a niche sport where it either like dials up the aggressiveness, like a UFC or boxing, or just kind of fades away. And let's say that happens. I think it's either, most likely it's soccer, which has lots of concussion issues there. Like you talk about issues with concussions in sport, it's like football, soccer, hockey, cheerleading actually has a ton of concussions. But if it's not soccer, and I think soccer has taken off in America in a way that we've been predicting it was going to since like the 1994 World Cup was here. It finally has taken off. Like people actually wake up on a Saturday morning to watch Bundesliga. I don't. But I think the answer is probably soccer. But I think basketball, I'm not sure it has that aggressiveness to it. I see basketball as more of a skill over strength game. But the way that basketball is sort of a thinking game, and the way it's morphed into that the past decade, the way what the Golden State Warriors have done, I think basketball is a really interesting case. It probably has a ceiling to it as far as becoming the sport of America. I think it would be more likely to be soccer. But I also think it would be interesting to see if some different version of football could take off. I don't think it would. Like, I don't think we'd tune into a no contact or a low contact version of football. But if the sport falls away, which I don't think it will, I think we would need something that's aggressive and frankly violent to replace it, because we love violence. We do. Like, there's something primal in that. So, thank you guys, girls, ladies, men, for coming out. This means a lot. Those of you I know and those of you I don't, thank you deeply.
Thank you.